Hello, this is Mrs. Solomon here with today's lesson on pedigrees. So for today's lesson on pedigrees, we're going to be using page 11 in your packet. So take a moment and please turn to that spot. Okay, now that you're on page 11, you'll notice that there's a diagram here, which is actually missing a piece. So before we advance any further, I would like for you to take a moment and add this line on to your pedigree. So a pedigree is very similar to a family tree, except in genetics, we're going to be using it to show how a trait is being passed on through a family. Okay, in this case, you'll see that it says Huntington's disease, a disease of the nervous system, is caused by an autosomal dominant gene. That means that everyone that inherits this has two genes they receive for it. It's on one of those first 22 pairs of chromosomes that we have. And unfortunately, it is a fatal disease. It breaks down a portion of your brain called the basal ganglia, which is in the center of your brain, that controls motor movement, remembering things, emotions, your personality, and things like that. So unfortunately, we do not have a cure for it yet. And it has a late age of onset. So people do not usually show symptoms of Huntington's disease until they're middle-aged. And by that time, they are married and had children and things like that. All right, before we start looking on and seeing how Huntington's disease is being passed on in this family, let's take a look at our key to see what information is given there. All right, so the key is showing us that a circle is a shape used to represent females or girls, and a square is the shape used to represent males or boys. So looking at our pedigree here, we can see that we have person A, which is a male, and person B, which is a female. And those individuals have this line connecting them. That line is showing that they are married or they had children together. And then this line going down is connected to the children that they had. The oldest child would be on the left side, which is person D. And their youngest child is over here at person H. And then you can see like this person was married and they had two children of their own, and so on. All right, so what we're going to do is before we move on to look at the letters that are there and see what information we're provided with this pedigree, I'm going to take a moment to check your understanding of how a pedigree is laid out. All right, so how many children did couple A and B have? So take a moment and count it up. All right, you should have identified 4 children. So if they had a daughter D, a son E, a daughter G, and a son H. All right, next one. How many grandchildren did couple A and B have? All right, so looking at this, we would say that couple A and B are our first generation, and then this would be the second generation. And down here, these would be their grandchildren. This would be the third generation. So when you count it up, they had 6 grandchildren. All right, how many sons did couple A and B have? How many sons did couple A and B have? All right, you should have counted 2. They had a son identified with an E, as well as a son identified with an H. You should not have included F or C in that number because even though they are squares and they're in that same generation line, they are joined with that horizontal marriage, we had children line. So that would be more like their son-in-law as opposed to a son. All right, what is the relationship of person D to person J? So find person J, then find person D. What is the relationship between those two people? All right, so looking on here, person J is over here, And I backtrack, I see person D, so that person is his mom. So person D is his mom. All right, so as we're looking at our pedigree, we want to keep in mind that we have parents, and those parents are passing those traits on. Okay, and that's where these genotypes are coming from. And you can see that our pedigree here does not have everyone's genotype filled in, and that's what we're going to be using kind of our detective skills to figure out. All right, so as we move through the questions, you're going to be trying to figure out who passed on what trait to the individuals and what can you figure out to identify that. All right, so let's take a look at our first question here. What is the probable genotype of individual D? Explain your answer. So we have individual D, this daughter here. All right, so to answer this, we want to take a look at what genotypes her parents had, as well as if she had children, what genotypes do her children have, because sometimes that can give you a clue as to the traits that are there. So we're going to walk through this one together, and then you're going to be moving on to go over and complete the rest of the questions. All right, so looking at person D, as I look at her son, I can see that there's a big H there. And when I look over here at her husband, he was little h, so all he could pass on was a the recessive normal gene to the son. And I see this Huntington's disease gene here. So that Huntington's gene had to have come from mom. So you can go ahead and just pencil that in. Okay, as you're working through these, one of the later questions asks you to identify who you can figure out their genotype for and who you cannot completely fill out a genotype for. So as you're going through, you should be penciling these in the open circles or squares, so that's less that you have to figure out later on. All right, so I have a blank filled in here because obviously we have 2 letters for the genotype, and I know that this H came from her, so I added that on. So now I'm going to take a look at her parents, and I can see that her dad also had a big H. So the big H had to come from dad because mom only had a little h. So mom must have passed on a lowercase h to her. So I'm going to fill that in and then take a moment and write my explanation. So what is the probable genotype of individual D? Explain your answer. The probable genotype is big H, little h. Her son would have received his capital H from her. Her mom was homozygous recessive, little h, and could only pass on that recessive little h to her. So take a moment and copy that down. And if you need, pause the video so that you can completely answer that question. All right, so moving on to number 2. What are the probable genotypes of individual H and I? So I've located H and I over here. And again, we're going to follow that same pattern, see what information we are given and what we're able to figure out. All right, so looking at this, again, I can see that they had a child, and the child is big H, homozygous dominant for the Huntington's disease gene. So I know that one big H came from dad and one big H came from mom. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil those in. Now, looking back with what I can see, I can trace that this person's parents are on this pedigree. And dad has the big H. Mom only is homozygous recessive. She is little h. So all mom could have passed on was that lowercase h. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in that lowercase h to show that this individual here is heterozygous for the Huntington's disease gene. They are big H, little h. Now, this individual here, I can't see her parents. All I can see is that they passed on a big H over here. That's all we know. All right, so this person, we only know one letter of their genotype. That's it. And you may find that as you continue on, you may only be able to figure out sometimes that partial genotype. Okay, because again, we can't see their parents. So we're not sure of what trait they have. All right, so take a moment and you are going to answer number 2 and write your description to explain your answer. And again, if you need, pause the video so that you give yourself time to write your response. All right, now you're going to be continuing to work and answering the questions on page 11. And you will notice that your next question that you encounter says, what is the probability that N will not have Huntington's disease? And we actually just learned how you can calculate the percent chance, the probability that someone would inherit that genetic disease. Correct? We just went over and worked with Punnett squares, and that's what you're going to be using here. You're going to be using a Punnett square or 2 to go over and figure out the probability that N would inherit that disease. Okay? Because if we recall, here we just figured out the genotype of dad, and we have a partial genotype for mom, and we're trying to figure out whether or not this person would inherit that genetic disease. So when you're doing your Punnett square, there are 2 possible genotypes. You're going to do one Punnett square with one possible genotype, such as big H, and then do another Punnett square with the other genotype, big H, little h, calculate your percents, and then your percentage, your probability here is going to be a range. It will be 2 numbers, and you would say, well, they have between a 33 to 73% chance of not having Huntington's disease. Okay, so you would calculate the probability for both Punnetts running both possible genotypes for that person I, and then you're going to have that as a range. And then again, you're answering numbers 4 and 5. All right, so take a moment. You're going to go through. You're going to continue working and finishing up page 11. Do not move on to page 12. That follows some different rules that we haven't gotten to yet. So just complete page 11. Have fun.